Hey everyone, Jody here with a quick word about the episode you're about to hear. It's one of our favorite episodes from the last year or so about the man who killed Abraham Lincoln. And we're bringing it to you today because all of us on the team keep talking about how wild of a story it is, and also because there's this new series on Apple TV called Manhunt, which is all about the aftermath of the Lincoln Assassination. It's as good an excuse as any to bring you one of our favorite recent episodes. Maybe you haven't heard it, maybe you've heard it and want to hear it again. So let's take a listen. We'll be back with brand new episodes next week. For now, enjoy. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avenger. This day, 1894. Thomas H. Boston Corbett is presumed dead in Minnesota. He is the victim of what came to be known as the Great Hinckley Fire. This was a massive forest fire which wiped out the town of Hinckley, Minnesota, and the surrounding forest. Somewhere between 450, 500 people died in that fire, and among the names listed was Boston Corbett. Now, what makes Boston Corbett notable? Why wasn't he just another relatively anonymous death in this tragic fire? Well, he'd faded a bit into obscurity by the time he got to Minnesota, but in the previous decades, Corbett had come to be known and call himself Lincoln's Avenger. Boston Corbett was the man who killed John Wilkes Booth days after Booth had assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Corbett was part of a regiment that cornered Booth on a Virginia farm, if you know this story. They had orders not to kill Booth, but Corbett claims at least that he nevertheless took a fatal shot and thus became the man who avenged Abraham Lincoln's death. And in the years and decades since, that act really seemed to consume him for better and really, mostly, as we'll discuss, for worse. So, here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Thomas H. Boston Corbett. We're going to call him Boston Corbett from now on. That's what most people called him. I suppose we should start with Booth's death, the days after Lincoln's assassination. How does Booth finally get cornered, captured, and killed?
I mean, it's probably one of the greatest manhunts in American history. Abraham Lincoln has died, and people are trying to find John Wilkes Booth wherever they think he might be. And so he is on the run. He actually ends up in a man's farm by the name of Richard Garrett and is hiding in sort of a barn and gets cornered by this regiment. And he refuses to come out. And so one of the tactics they used to get him to try to come out is they set parts of the barn on fire. And even still, he refuses. And it's not clear exactly how he is killed, but he's shot in the back of the head. And Corbett is the one who claims to have shot him in this process. He says that John Wilkes Booth was trying to take aim at him, and so he shot in self-defense. But again, it's a little murky.
And it seemed like at that point, Booth was dragged out of the barn because he lives for another 2 hours with this gunshot to the head. It's a pretty agonizing death. But when the unit is asked who did this, who shot him, Corbett's the one who steps forward and says he's the shooter. And when his commander says, why did you violate this order? He says, Providence directed me.
No. Which is a little bit of a hint into how the mind of Corbett works. We should maybe do an episode specifically on the Booth escape and the Booth manhunt and so forth, because I don't know this right off the top of my head, but I think the Garretts were really interesting people too, the farm, and there was like questions about whether they were hiding him or whether they tipped him off and so forth. But and
worth saying that John Wilkes Booth was a pretty famous actor, so very recognizable as well. So hiding him was a tricky thing to do.
Yeah, and it is true that Garrett and I think the 12-year-old son, his 12-year-old son who were there, they contradicted Corbett's testimony because Corbett had claimed that he was sort of maybe acting in self-defense and that Booth, he had seen Booth reach for a gun and so forth. And so they contradicted that. So, it thus starts this interesting thing of Corbett kind of claiming that he did this, maybe claiming self-defense, but then also really realizing like, he eventually starts calling himself Lincoln's Avenger, really starting to embrace this. But to get through some of the details, I mean, Corbett is brought to trial, or so to speak. There are repercussions here because, again, he was contradicting orders to keep Booth to capture Booth alive, right?
Right. He's taken directly to the Secretary of War. At the time, it was Edwin Stanton. And he gives that, recounting that you were just saying, Jody, he says, it was him or me. He was going to shoot me if I didn't shoot him. He claims that he had tried to just disable Booth and not kill him, but his arm slipped or Booth moved. And I think that if you want to understand the legend of Lincoln's Avenger that comes out of this, Stanton's response is pretty dramatic. He pauses and then he says, "The rebel is dead. The patriot lives. He has spared the country expense, continued excitement, and trouble. Discharge the patriot." So very dramatic.
That is. But it's also a way of saying, like, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean?
Right.
Eventually, he was going to get, executed, if not assassinated. And so the whole idea of taking him alive would have only been to sort of question him about intent. But even his intent was clear. So, the fact that he was gone, it was sort of like, okay, well, at least he's captured and we don't have to spend more dollars trying to investigate either the murder of Lincoln or the murder of John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah. But yeah, Stanton calling him in that moment, the patriot, really does set, as we've said, like so often history starts to just write itself in those moments and that choice. I mean, can you imagine the counterfactual of if Corbett had now gone on trial, right? Yeah. And the one person in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination sort of on trial is the guy who killed Booth. I mean, that would have been, who knows what the fallout of that would have been.
But instead, he walks out of the War Department after this acquittal, and he's greeted by this large cheering crowd. He's taken to the famous photographer Matthew Brady's studio to have his portrait taken. People are asking for autographs. It really is this atmosphere of heroics, right? He's cheered as a hero, yeah.
And people want to buy the gun that he used. I mean, it is people saw him as like a savior in a way, or someone that redeemed something that was lost. And so he kind of rides that fame wave as much as he possibly can.
Yeah.
Hey, our Radiotopia colleagues, the Kitchen Sisters, have a new episode I think you'll want to check out. It's called Buildings Speak, Stories of Pioneering Women Architects, hosted by Frances McDormand. Trailblazers, groundbreakers, skyscraper visionaries, little-known stories of Julia Morgan, Natalie DeBlois, Amazalie Meredith, women who changed the skyline and the built environment that surrounds us today. Listen to the Kitchen Sisters present everywhere you find podcasts and at kitchensisters.org.
It's funny, as I'm thinking about this story, I'm reminded of Robert Ford, the guy who killed Jesse James. And Robert Ford, at least according to the movie, and I think according to the legend, kind of like had this sort of like, I was this avenging angel, but then it starts to turn on him and starts to get sinister and it starts to consume him. And he's like trying to sell pictures of Jesse James's dead body. I don't know. I think I'm conflating these vibes in my head, but I think it is sort of similar. Corbett gets a little bit of money. Yeah.
There was a ransom out for John Wilkes Booth, and the money is about $100,000. He gets a portion of that. He gets, about $1,600, $1,653, which in today's money is like $29,000. So it's not nothing. It's a significant amount of money in which he can, sort of fund any endeavor he wanted to do after that.
Yeah. But the endeavor he wants to fund is really just being Boston Corbett, right? Yeah. And that really is kind of, I think we can now start a sort of tour of his very twisted and tragic,
disturbed life,
aftermath of this, including, we've hinted at it a little bit, but including the sort of introduction of real biblical kind of overtones here. And so he refers to himself as the avenging angel, but he talks about how it was God who avenged Abraham Lincoln, not me. What a God we have that he willed me to do this, and so forth. And then he goes on, I guess at one point he becomes a preacher touring the country, but his behavior becomes, I think more and more fanatical in every sense.
And erratic.
Right?
He can't keep a job. And this was before he joined the military, but certainly after. He is such a religious fanatic that he's oftentimes let go because he won't stop proselytizing on the job, or he'll stop in the middle of a job to pray or to sing songs or to chastise certain people for their, beliefs. And so he becomes a little unhinged, and it's hard to sort of get him to stay in reality. And he commits a lot of heinous acts. I mean, one of the things that's most disturbing is that he castrates himself with a pair of scissors. He wanted to keep himself pure and thought that his sexual thoughts were keeping him in a life of sin. And so he does this incredible act that should have tipped a lot of people off that he was not mentally well. That he was not mentally well, that he needed to get some help, real help. And it kind of takes too long for him to actually get that, if he gets it at all.
Can I just tell our listeners that, we have these prep documents where we have information about the story that Jacob Feldman puts together. They're brilliant. And in it, there's this line that says, in order to avoid sexual temptation, Corbett castrated himself with a pair of scissors. And Kellie just does one of those Google Doc comments, right? She highlights the sentence and adds a comment in Google Doc. And the Google Doc comment is just, oh, God. GAWD, exclamation point, exclamation point. But yeah, that's the appropriate response.
Yes.
That's like, whoa. It's a lot. It's a lot.
It was an unexpected turn in the story.
For sure. For sure.
But I think it's worth going back into his history a little bit to make sense of this, because religious zealotry can come from a lot of different places. But in this case, Boston Corbett's trade was as a milliner. So he was a hat maker. And we all know from Alice in Wonderland this phrase, the Mad Hatter. Well, that was linked to the way that millinery worked, which was that it was heavily dependent on mercury. And so people who made hats imbibed a lot of mercury through their skin, through the fumes, and it causes all kinds of things. It causes hallucinations, it causes psychiatric breaks, and it's as he's imbibing all of these mercury solids and fumes that he begins to display this religious zealotry, where he stops to preach in the middle of work, where he castrates himself. Like, this is something that is building. And then he goes back to millinery after the war. And so he's back in that very toxic environment.
Okay, hold on. I have to stop you. I was today years old when I realized that the Mad Hatter reference is about the toxic chemicals that go into hat making. What?
Isn't that wild?
I think Mad Hatter was a thing. Mad Hatter's disease was a thing for a while, and then they wrote it as a character. But there you go.
Yeah, because there's a phrase like "mad as a hatter," and it comes from this idea. So I think it's. He could have also had other psychological problems. He does end up, he becomes a Methodist preacher for a while. He goes off and he homesteads in Kansas, and then he ends up in an asylum because he is becoming increasingly erratic, and people are worried that he's a danger to himself and others.
Yeah. And, to connect this to the death of Booth, and this is speculation, and this is kind of the sort of lost to history, but, in some ways, you can look at he kills Booth, and there's a sort of breaking point there, and it consumes him. And I think that's certainly part of the story. But it's also kind of like, who is the kind of person who would maybe defy orders and take a shot at Booth and then start to tell a story? Maybe someone who was unwell to begin with. And so, I think that's part of the story here. We've described some of the kind of paths he goes down and the sort of itinerant life he leads. He is throughout. I just like this image is really striking to me. But he also is, from time to time, he gives lectures about the shooting of Booth, and he has like lantern slides, and he goes into Sunday schools or women's groups or tent revival meetings, and he gives these little lectures. And then often, apparently, like, he just takes it too far, and people get really put off by him, or he gets in fights. There's an incident where he's at the Kansas House of Representatives, and he's reportedly brandishes a gun, and he confronts people, and he is he is unwell, and as you said, Niki, he ends up in the Topeka Asylum for the Insane, and then he starts to float around and eventually ends up in Hinckley in eastern Minnesota, reportedly just kind of like living in the woods outside of Hinckley. And then there is this Hinckley fire, and maybe fitting, that's how John Wilkes Booth died under mysterious circumstances, consumed by fire. And there is no official record. There is a reference to a Thomas Corbett appearing on the list of dead and missing in the Hinckley fire, but beyond that, there's no definitive proof that it was Lincoln's Avenger, this man who died in that fire. And that actually leads to a number of people in the years after sort of claiming that, oh no, I'm actually this guy. I'm actually this guy.
Yeah, he's got a lot of imitators who come out of the woodwork after.
I mean, there's money to be made, y'all. There's money to be made and telling these really fantastical stories about being shot at and then taking the shot and, all of that. I mean, I get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think as a button on this whole thing, it is worth noting that it's not until 1941 that the U.S. government finally bans using mercury in the making of hats.
Way too late.
1941. Way too late.
Yeah.
Way too late. Why do you need mercury to make a hat? Make it make sense for me. I don't understand. Is it not leather? Is it not cotton? What are we doing?
I'm sure the milliners in our audience will write in and explain.
Yes, we want the explanation.
And then,
man.
In the late 50s, a Boy Scout troop outside of Concordia, Kansas, built a roadside monument to Corbett, located in the region where he had sort of ended up in Kansas. And there was a small sign there. And it is, by all reports, still there, and that might be the only place where there's a sort of monument or plaque to Corbett. But
I mean, should I read what the plaque says?
Yeah.
It says, Boston Corbett Dugout, 60 yards south, is the site of the dugout home of Boston Corbett, who as a soldier shot John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln, and then erected by the Boy Scout Troop 31, Concordia, Kansas, 1958.
Amazing.
Yeah. Wow. Still not going.
Yeah, still not going.
You got the picture. It's fine.
We got the pictures. But yeah, there's let me tell you, Concordia, Kansas, it's out there. And this dugout where he lived. But apparently there were 2 6-shooters on the monument, and those were stolen in the 2000s. But yeah, it's there. So if anyone's been by, let us know.
Wow.
Okay. That brings us to the end of the tale of Boston Corbett, Lincoln's Avenger. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia. From